Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. This conversation is part of Sikhs in Action series, reflecting on early migration and settlement in the United States, and we'll consider how these histories shape Sikh identity today. We are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Tejpal Singh Beniwal. He's a scholar, educator, and community leader dedicated to preserving Sikh American history. He co founded the Sikh American History Project and serves on the board of Asian and Pacific Islanders in historic preservation. His research and community work and community center work explore Sikh identity, representation, and activism, advancing public understanding through education, preservation, and community engagement. I am Harpreet Singh. I'm a scholar of Sikh studies based at Harvard, and I'm also the co-founder of the Sikh Coalition. So we'll begin by having Dr. Beniwal give us a presentation on Sikh American history, and then we'll engage in a Q&A session. Dr. Beniwal, the floor is yours.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you, Dr. Harpreet Singh, for the introduction. And then also, just want to say a huge thank you to the Sikh Foundation, and then also the Sarbjit Aurora Endowed Chair over at UC Santa Cruz in Sikh and Punjabi Studies for hosting this series, Sikhs in Action, and giving an opportunity for scholars and folks such as myself an opportunity to share our research with the broader Sangat. So as mentioned, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. As mentioned, today I'll be focusing on brief history of Sikhs in America and why history matters and why it's relevant to the present day. So beginning with really the earlier history, and then we'll eventually conclude with the present day and what's going on now and why it's important for us to be the caretakers of our own history. Some of y'all may have seen this Six Allowed to Land, this newspaper article that was shared out of San Francisco in 1899. And typically, this newspaper article is really utilized to highlight Sikh immigration to the United States. Several individuals, scholars, community leaders, community organizations constantly use this newspaper article from San Francisco to show that Sikhs have been migrating to the United States since their late 1890s. But what I really want to do is, it's very important for us to also dig a little bit deeper rather than just looking at the surface level of what is being shared with these newspapers. Because when we do dig a little bit deeper into this newspaper, it talks about even just the title, Sikhs allowed to land. The term allowed, when we think about that term, when somebody is allowing somebody else to do something, that hints to a social hierarchy that is in place. And what is that social hierarchy that is in place that is showing through this article? It is that white immigration officers are allowing for four individuals from Punjab to land in the United States, and they are enforcing laws that were implemented or passed by white immigration officers, but they're doing all of this on stolen land. Keeping in mind this land is for the indigenous people and it belongs to the indigenous people. But eventually, what happens, as most of us, if not all of us, are aware, with European immigration to the United States, and then those come to California, so they start leading and controlling the land here, and now they are the ones who are deciding who is allowed to land or not. These four individuals, Bakshish Singh, Budh Singh, Varyam Singh, and Sohava Singh, were held in Angel Island for several days before they were eventually released and able to enter San Francisco. And this is a continuation of the story of these four individuals. When we typically learn about these four individuals, the most common article that we see is this one right here, Six Allowed to Land. But actually, these four individuals, Bakshish Singh, Budh Singh, Varyam Singh, and Sohava Singh, they were followed around San Francisco for a number of weeks, roughly 2 to 3 weeks. They were followed around because despite the fact that there were traces of Punjabi Sikhs in the United States earlier, this was something that was still new to a lot of individuals. So seeing turban-wearing individuals enter from the shores of the Pacific Ocean was something that was very new for them. So these journalists were following these four individuals around San Francisco, the streets of San Francisco. And these four actually did not come as laborers. They actually came to sell silk. They came to sell silk at one of the largest stores in California at that time, the Emporium in San Francisco. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it's one of the ads, and this ad was shared across a number of days over a number of newspapers. And it talks about how Hindu sun worshippers who arrived from Lahore, India, last Tuesday are the only people of their sect in America, and they'll be in the store all day, Friday and Saturday. But the next sentence is the one that's really important, and I want folks to pay attention to. Don't fail to see these extraordinary people. These four individuals who came to sell silk and make a honest living here in the United States, here in San Francisco, they were being sold based off of their looks. The newspapers, the journalists, they wanted to point towards these turban-wearing individuals, to these sardars, and say, hey, these people are very unique looking. It was like a circus act for them. This is the reason why they were being followed around. Those in San Francisco, those in the United States had never seen, turban-wearing individuals before. So their facial features, the star, their turbans, it was being sold as if it was a circus show. And then even on the left-hand side, the larger photo, what you see is Hindus will worship the sun from San Francisco's housetops. Again, they refer to Sikhs as sun worshippers because when they were following them around for those 2 to 3 weeks when they first landed, they were watching to see what these individuals were doing. And what were these individuals doing? In the morning, as the sun rose, they would get up and do nitnem. In the evening, as the sun was setting, they would do the nitnem as well in Drera side. As an outsider looking in, not asking questions and just watching them, when you see the sun is rising, the sun is setting, these four individuals who you know nothing about are chanting in a language that you know nothing about. It is easy to jump to that conclusion that, oh, they're probably worshiping the sun because that's when they're doing their parties, once it's rising and setting. So again, it goes to show what the mindset of the white man was when Sikhs were first arriving. And just kind of continuing off of that, it wasn't a new problem for them. Or sorry, it wasn't something that was entirely new because initially, what before Sikhs faced this discrimination, other Asian groups were facing the discrimination as well. What we see on the left-hand side is a picture of Uncle Sam booting a Chinese immigrant. When we get the Chinese Exclusion Act, this was also enacted upon Japanese immigrants, but on the right hand side again, it's another cartoon, political cartoon that we see, very similar to the one we see on the left hand side when Uncle Sam booting Chinese immigrants. Now on the right hand side, Uncle Sam lifting a turban wearing individual with the label Hindu, trying to return him back to British India. And for those who may not be familiar, you will see several different newspaper articles, news clippings, political cartoons that I'm sharing throughout this presentation that shows the title of Hindu or the label of Hindu. That Hindu label wasn't for the Hindu in terms of a religious category, but actually is a ethnic category that referred to all South Asians at that time. But as we can see from these two political cartoons, it was something that continued from Chinese immigrants to Japanese immigrants, and then to South Asian and Sikh immigrants who were coming in the early 1900s in larger numbers. What we get from there is the one of the largest anti-Sikh persecutions, which happens in 1907 in Bellingham, Washington, where South Asian migrants, those migrants from British India, were expelled from the city altogether, and some of them ended up traveling north to Canada, whereas some of them traveled down south, eventually making their way to California. Other issues that California migrants faced was the Alien Land Law Act, which prohibited South Asian immigrants from owning any land in California. But despite the fact that, um, and this was again a something a recurring issue. Again, in Marys, it wasn't only in Bellingham. We see it in Marysville, California, right by Yuba City. Again, for those that are familiar, Yuba City is home to one of the largest nuggets, if not the largest nugget in the United States. Um, right next to it, Hindus were driven out as well from the two houses that they were residing in. Roughly 70 South Asians were residing there. Also, students who were studying at UC Berkeley were targeted. There was a student that was, again, some people may be familiar with an incident that recently happened in the Bay Area in San Jose, where a student was targeted, and his turban, his dastard was targeted, and was there was an attempt to forcibly remove his dastard as well. So this has happened before. It's nothing new. And it's happened in the Bay Area before, despite the rich history of our community in the Bay Area. It's happened at UC Berkeley where individuals were trying to forcibly remove a Sardar's pag. And then again, so we have laborers that were attacked, we have students that were attacked, and then also Sikh women. There was an effort by the US government to ensure that the only individuals migrating to the United States from Asia were Asian men, because we as in the United States wanted to utilize the workforce with at the same time ensuring that they weren't settling down and making roots in the United States. So for this reason, Asian women were prohibited from entering the United States. And then, with Sikh men coming to the United States, South Asian men coming to the United States, newspaper articles were talking about the next issue we're going to have is now Sikh women. South Asian women are going to come, these men are going to start bringing their wives over and start settling in the United States, and we'll have a real problem in the United States then. All of these issues combined is ultimately what cultivates the need for the Sangha to come together and decide to establish a Sikh society. And that's the term that they use, is, establishing a Sikh society where in order to bring East Indians into unity for the welfare of the human race. Um, Despite the fact that Baba Jawala Singh, Baba Vasaka Singh, two early immigrants, had owned a, a number of land in Holt, California, which is a small town just west of Stockton, California, and they owned this since 1910. It took them roughly 2 years as a community effort to really establish or to purchase property in South Stockton. So the property was purchased in South Stockton. As you can see from these are original meeting minutes from the Stockton Gurdwara Sahib. And this meeting minute, the one on the right-hand side, is from August 4th. And this was when they're talking about purchasing the building and the lot in South Stockton. So officially it was established in 1912, and it wasn't only it wasn't only a religious institution for the Sikh community at that time or for the broader South Asian community. It was a social, political, educational, cultural, and religious hub. And that's one thing that I've been really adamant about and really pushing a lot of folks is when we talk about the Gurdwara as the Sikh community, as a Sikh community, a lot of us tend to refer to it as a Sikh place of worship or a Sikh temple. And even we see it right here on the photo right here, a dedicated new Sikh temple on Grand Street. And for me, one thing that I want to get out of, and I've been thinking a lot about, especially looking at this early history of Stockton Gurdwara, but also the earlier histories of the establishment of gurdwaras, and they were never meant to be solely religious institutions for the community. They weren't meant to be simply Sikh temples. They were always meant to be a social institution as well, a political institution as well, educational institutions. And Stockton really embodied all of that. A few examples is in 1914, there was an immigration hearing in the US Congress, where there was conversations to expel or place more restrictions on the immigration of South Asians to the United States. In order to combat this, in order to combat the hate and the conversation that was happening in Washington, D.C., the Sangat in the Pacific Coast met at Stockton Gurdwara a number of times and had conversations on what they could do regarding the immigration hearing. What they ultimately decided to do was fund a delegation of three individuals, paying for all of their tickets, paying for their cost to travel, cost of stay, to travel to Washington, D.C. from Stockton and advocate for immigration rights in front of the U.S. Congress. And this entire delegation, everything, and all of their work was, and all of their efforts, everything was funded by Stockton Gurdwara and the early Sikh Sangat that was there. Even after the immigration hearing had happened, there were a number of meetings afterwards to have conversations on what is next. So they were mobilizing and organizing at Stockton Gurdwara. Um, and then even when we talk about, and the 1914 immigration hearing is just one example of a number of campaigns that the Stockton Gurdwara was involved in. There was another issue in 1919 regarding immigration, 1917 as well, then going into the 1920s. So it continued over a number of years where Stockton Gurdwara was constantly advocating, sending letters of support to elected officials, constant communication with not only local elected officials, but also the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson at the time. Um, so extremely involved in US politics, but also transnational politics, understanding and looking at what was going on in their homeland, looking at what was going on in South Asia. A lot of the individuals who traveled to the United States, they did so to seek economic opportunities outside of the British colonial structure. um, they come to the United States and they see that freedom isn't really here for Sikhs or for South Asians. It's not, we're not free here in the United States either. So the conversations for the Ghadar Party and Azadi and freedom from British colonial rule also begins in Stockton Gurdwara. And the Ghadar Party, for those not aware, it's an anti-colonial movement for a sovereign state. And a lot of us are aware that, and a lot of conversations about it beginning and it being established in Astoria, Oregon, on the left-hand side of the Finnish Socialist Hall, being the site of the first conference that they had for the Ghadar Party in 1913. And that site was eventually burned down in the 20s. And then currently it's a Motel 6 in Astoria. So if you travel to Astoria, it's very easy to miss a lot of this history, but what you'll see is that Motel 6 on the upper right-hand corner. And that's the site of the old Finnish Socialist Hall where the Ghadar Party's first conference was held. And the Ghadar Party in that capacity was first started. But the initial conversations for the Ghadar were actually in Holt, California. As I mentioned earlier, the farm that was owned by Baba Javala Singh and Baba Vasakha Singh. On the bottom photo, what you see is a handwritten note from the Secretary of Stockton Gurdwara in the 1940s. And um, in this note, they detail it's a detailed history of Sikhs in the United States and Sikhs and Stockton Gurdwara. And it states right here, ਇਹੋ ਹੀ Pacific Coast ਖਾਲਸਾ ਦੀਵਾਨ ਸੁਸਾਇਟੀ ਸਟਾਕਟਨ ਹੈ ਜਿੱਥੋਂ ਕਿ ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੀ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਲਈ ਸਾਡੇ ਬਜ਼ੁਰਗਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਗਰਤ ਆਈ ਸੀ ਜਿਸ ਦੀ ਮਿਸਾਲ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਕਾਇਮ ਹੈ, right? So talking about this is the very Pacific Coast Khalsa Divan Society in Stockton where our elders, that fire for a free homeland was fueled in Holt, California. It was fueled in Stockton. And the leaders in Stockton would frequently travel. They established newspapers in 1912 as well that predated the Ghadar newspapers. And in these newspapers, where they're also talking about Azadi, they're talking about a free homeland. All of these were things that Sikhs, South Asians across the Pacific coast, from those in Vancouver, Washington, and Oregon, and across California, were also looking at and reading these newspapers that were coming out of Stockton, California in 1912. And those laborers in Washington and Oregon, in some of their handwritten diaries for the Gadri Babe, they talk about how these soldiers talk about how they were waiting for the leaders of Stockton, the Bajorgs of Stockton, to come to Astoria, come to Oregon, come to Washington to help guide them. So a lot of the early conversations for Gadar, even though a lot of academics and scholars give credit to Astoria, Oregon, um, it predates that in Stockton, and there's a lot of conversations that were happening about Gadar without the name Gadar. So, and there was conversations about in Baba Vasaka Singh's handwritten poems, he talks specifically about a meeting in 1910, 1911, where, again, before the Gadar Party was officially established, where there were Parmanand and Lala Harde are two prominent figures that people like to point to when talking about the Gadar Party. They were asked point blank at a divan in Holt, California, whether they would fight for an Azad homeland and for a free homeland, and both of them flat out denied it and said that they were concerned about their immigration status, so they didn't want to catch the eye of the government. So despite the fact that these individuals are now celebrated by a number of individuals and a number of other scholars, when we look at the handwritten documents and the handwritten notes of the Gadar Party members, it tells a different story. Again, also what we see right here is a world map, but those nations highlighted in blue um, are nations where the Gadar Party had some sort of presence in. And this isn't the most updated. I know, Dr. Amrit Deol, who's over at Fresno State, is doing an amazing job in researching the Gadar Party. Um, and she's tracked down a few more countries, but still seeing how many countries are in blue, seeing how much reach that the Gadar Party had, this too happening in the 19 teens, right? It's amazing to see. It's something that is also a learning lesson for us, in being that this is before the age of social media. This is when they were mailing newsletters, they were mailing newspapers. There would be a week-long delay sometimes before you get the news. But despite that, when the call for soldiers to go back to British India came in 1914 following the start of World War One, 8,000 individuals traveled back to South Asia to fight the Gadar. Each time I think about that number, and think about that in the 19 teens, I'm always fascinated. And these 8,000 came from a number of different countries. Um, I think about it now, how much it takes for us to mobilize and get people to go anywhere, even if it's, a dinner in downtown, wherever in the city that we live in. Sometimes it's a mission, but to let go of everything and go back and everything that you saved, everything that you were providing for your families, let go of all of that and fight for your homeland. 8,000 individuals to do that in an organized manner in the 19 teens was just absolutely amazing. So, in now in 1929, what begins to happen is, despite the fact that we have a lot of restriction in terms of immigration, the community is still around Central Valley, is still around Stockton, because that is the only Gurdwara in the United States at the time. And it truly becomes the capital of the Sikh faith in the US, and it becomes a growing movement in the US, um, despite the fact that people are traveling back. And this is when the Gurdwara expands and eventually opens up a larger hall, because the initial hall that was opened up in 1915 became too small for the community. Two individuals that are closely connected with Stockton Gurdwara, but also very closely connected with not just Sikh American history, but broader Asian American history and American history in general. The first being Bhagat Singh Thind. Bhagat Singh Thind, for those who aren't familiar, was the first Sikh in the U.S. Army, fighting during enlisting during World War One in 1918, just towards the tail end of it. But Bhagat Singh Thind is really known for their Supreme Court landmark case, Bhagat Singh Thind versus United States in 1923, in which the common definition of Caucasian at that time, or the common man's definition of what white means, and how we understand Caucasian today, was decided during this court case. Again, we have Bhagat Singh Thind, who is a veteran, served in the U.S. Army during World War One, received their citizenship, but also lost their citizenship twice. And then the court case that went all this to the Supreme Court was to see whether or not those who are Punjabi, those who are South Asian, are classified as Caucasian, because Caucasians at that time were able to gain citizenship. And he was arguing an anthropological definition, but at the end of the day, they looked at him, and the simple question was, by looking at Bhagat Singh Thind, is he white? And ultimately, they decided that he wasn't white based off of his looks. But following the decision, a few weeks after, there was a large meeting in Stockton Gurdwara to have conversations about what can be done now. Now that the United States Supreme Court has decided that South Asians and Sikhs are unable to become citizens, what is our next step? So it wasn't just that, these individuals were working in a silo. Bhagat Singh Thind was somebody who was in the US Army, then started advocating for immigration rights, and then became a spiritual writer and philosopher down the road. He was always tapped in with the community. He was always tapped in with Sangat, and looked towards Stockton Gurdwara when the U.S. Supreme Court denied him his citizenship. Um, and even afterwards, this is when we start getting a lot of campaigns. There were pamphlets that were published by Stockton Gurdwara to advocate for Punjabi Sikhs and South Asians to gain citizenship. But then also in the early 1930s, when it was as Bhagat Singh Thind was looking to become, just traveling the United States and educating individuals on who Sikhs and who Punjabis are, he actually received a certificate from Stockton Gurdwara to officially be labeled as a Gyani. So he was a traveling Gyani on behalf of Stockton Gurdwara beginning in the 1930s and well through the 40s. The second individual who's is known in terms of Asian American history, but also has really deep connections to Stockton Gurdwara, is Dalip Singh Sand. Again, right off the gate, people might be familiar that he's the first Asian American member of Congress during the U.S. Congress in 1957. But when Dalip Singh Sand first came to the United States, actually, their earlier stories, when they were still a student in Punjab, one of their relatives talks about how Dalip Singh Sand was actively interested in and engaging with the Ghadar party. Mind you, the Lifting song comes to the United States in the early 1920s. So just a few years prior, when he was in his teens, the Lifting song was paying attention to what was happening in terms of the Ghadar party, this anti-colonial movement to free South Asia from British rule. And in the 1920s, as he's a student at Berkeley, he's staying at one of the houses that Stockton Gurdwara owns in Berkeley for students to stay rent free. And the idea for Stockton Gurdwara, the reason for Stockton Gurdwara to own these houses was so students can focus on their education and focus on community work. And the idea is, if we are supporting students now through their education, so they don't have to focus on tuition, because scholarships were also offered, so they don't have to focus on tuition or paying for rent. Down the road, the community will, these students will remember that the community supported them, and that now these individuals will automatically then start supporting the community as well. So they invested in the future. They invested in the students at Berkeley. And Dalip Singh Sand would, as a student at UC Berkeley, he would frequent Stockton Gurdwara and give lectures about the Babur Akalis. They would give lectures about what was happening, about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. They were giving lectures, talking about Sikhi and talking about the movements that were Akali movements that were happening in Punjab at the time. eventually, once the Leaping Song graduates, they are unable to get a job despite having a PhD, so they shift down to Southern California and become a farmer. As they're a farmer, they're still connected to Stockton Gurdwara and eventually become the secretary of Stockton Gurdwara. And through the early years when in the 1920s, when Dalip Singh Sahan was speaking at the Gurdwara stage about the Akali movements, about the Babur Akalis and what was happening, to the time when he was selected to be the secretary, all of these were the early starts to San's career as a genuine speaker, as a good speaker, and it really helped raise Son to the level that he eventually got to. In Southern California at this time, he also ran for judge, and he became a judge in Imperial Valley. So while he was a secretary and a judge, Dalip Singh San decides to run for Congress, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky in terms of how does he uh, play with his identity? How does he still highlight his Sikh identity? But at the same time, when he was running for Congress, he was intentionally hiding his Sikh identity. Dalip Singh San, when running for Congress, he ran as Judge D.S. Sand. When we're looking at just, that name in itself, Judge D.S. Sand, and thinking at like a lot of the debates weren't televised at the time. So a lot of the engagement that voters had with elected officials or candidates was through newspapers or through billboards that they were seeing. So when seeing Judge D.S. Sand on a billboard or in a newspaper, what that points to is, again, Sand is very close to the white surname Saunders. And then the two aspects of his name that really showcase that he is a Punjabi Sikh man was Dalip Singh. Both of those, Dalip and Singh, was abbreviated to DS, and his name became on in any campaign in any sort of manner became Judge Sand. So for those who weren't able to see him physically, they're just seeing Judge Sand on a lot of these billboards, a lot of um, the newspaper articles. So he was very strategic and very intentional about his name. And then another thing, beyond that, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Marwa, Amarjit Singh Marwa from who has since passed, but from Los Angeles. And Dr. Marwa was a good friend of Dalip Singh San, but also helped with Dalip Singh San's campaign. And in this interview that I had with Dr. Marwa, they share with me that during several of Dalip Singh San's campaign events, any turban-wearing individual who was helping with the campaign or even in the audience during a public event or during a debate, whatever it may be, throughout the campaign, was kindly asked to wait in the back room while the public was there. So despite being a Punjabi Sikh himself, he hid his name to be strategic and try to fool some of the voters. But then even for the public events, he was intentionally putting the turban wearing individuals, the bearded individuals, away from the public eye. Again, so there's a lot more, and it's a lot more complex. The Living story is a lot more complex, and even looking at the U.S. in general, what was happening at this time, going right into again the Cold War, Dalip Singh Sand being from India and from British India or India at this time, a lot of conversation on where India stands during the Cold War. If we get Dalip Singh Sand to join Congress, he can be an advocate and we can at least neutralize India or ensure that India is siding with US during this Cold War. So again, there's a lot more happening, and understanding Dalip Singh Sand's story in that sense and with all of these details, I think is very important because it helps us understand how we can tackle some of these issues that we are facing today as well. Right? In the era of Dalip Singh Sand, this same era is the era where we get the era of quote unquote educated Sikhs in the United States. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, with the restriction that was placed at the federal level, a lot of those who stayed were those who eventually assimilated. And a ton of scholars assimilated to the point where in the main hall, not in the Langar hall, because now we see several gurdwaras where there are tables and chairs in the Langar hall. But in the main hall, there were kursiyan, as you can see in the photo. There were chairs in the main hall, and the individuals who were sitting on the chairs would actually remove the head covering. So the inside of the gurdwara looked closer to the inside of a church rather than the inside of a traditional gurdwara. They were coming on with their shoes, removing their hat. There was a hat rack outside. So coming in Nangesir and sitting on chairs. But they did elevate the Guru Granth Sahib Ji Saroop much higher. As you can see in this photo, the Chandoa Sahib and the roof, how close it is, and where the Granthis Bag and the star is, right? So it's very close to the roof, so they elevated it really high. But authors, scholars from that time, and early Sikh American historians, such as Bruce LeBrec, and a lot of these individuals did amazing work, but being outsiders from the community, for them, the way that they classified it was that there were changes in the Sikh tradition because the individuals were now better educated. And that the backward and unnecessarily strict interpretations of Gurdwara etiquette, it was unnecessary. And what were these backward and unnecessarily strict interpretations? Sitting on the floor, crisscross applesauce, right? Covering your head. So a lot of the practices that we are familiar with a Gurdwara now, these were deemed to be backward, unnecessarily strict. And this was because the Sikhs classified themselves as being more educated, and there were a lot of interracial marriages, and a lot of the Punjabi men were marrying either white women or Mexican women. And with them also visiting the Gurdwara, it was easier for them to sit on chairs. So there was a number of things that led to the introduction of chairs in the main hall. But again, the idea is the fact that there's this belief that if we become assimilated, if we start let go of our own practices, if we let go of our own traditions, if our religious practices are more in line with the religious practices of the West, then we are educated. Then we aren't backwards. This need to fit in. Here's just another quick photo. So the most important thing is, when we're talking about all of this, is the question that comes is who gets to tell history? What happens when stories are told about people instead of by them? Who decides what is remembered? A lot of these questions or these questions are questions that I get a lot when I give these lectures. So that's why I decided to specifically talk about it in this manner as well. Is a lot of times now when we look at the work in the present day of what is being told about the Sikh community, what is being shared about the Sikh community, there's a lot of efforts by various organizations to tell the Sikh story and to make sure that we are the caretakers of our own stories and the storytellers rather than it being told by somebody else. Because when that does happen, when our story is told by somebody else, there's a good chance that a lot of the care and a lot of the details in that story are forgotten. Something as simple as, if remembering something like partition, partition versus independence, um, it's not neutral because, again, each of those words carries weight. If we talk about 1947 as independence, it has a different weight behind it. It talks about the freeing of a nation from colonial rule. It talks about, um, again, communities that were once colonized are now able to determine their future for themselves. That's the story of independence. But when we talk about the story of partition, we talk about the individuals who lost their lives. We talk about the stolen homeland, how Punjab was split, partitioned in two. So again, little things like this, and who decides what is remembered? To be very frank, it's whoever cares. Once again, who decides what is remembered is whoever cares to decide what is remembered and whoever cares to tell that history. It is a shared responsibility, and that responsibility looks like it's community-centered histories, where communities are not just subjects of the history, but they are the authors of it as well. Because simple inclusion isn't enough. You can still be included in the conversation and still be attacked, though. You can still be included in conversations. For example, I gave a talk this past weekend to some high schoolers, and one of them was telling me about how in their textbook they learn about the Sikh community, but the only aspect in which they learn about the Sikh community is in world history when they talk about how Sikhs are a sect of Hinduism and Islam, and then also how, you know, Sikh bodyguards in 1984 assassinated Indira Gandhi. Without context, it tells a very different story. And when we are the subjects of history, somebody else can control how that narrative is told. Because if we aren't the ones telling our own stories, somebody else eventually will down the road, and then we catch ourselves backtracking and trying to defend those stories or trying to shift those stories and those narratives. And that's ultimately what led to starting this nonprofit that I helped co-found, the Sikh American History Project, and it's ultimately a nonprofit that's dedicated to unearthing, preserving, and promoting the history of Sikhs in the United States. How can we ensure that these stories are told, they are preserved, and they are celebrated by the community? If you guys have any questions, you guys can about the Sikh American History Project or about just anything that I mentioned and shared, you can feel free to reach out to the Sikh American History Instagram, or you can email us. But thank you so much. I just want to say thank you again to Tanmeet, everyone at Sikh Foundation, to Dr. Harpreet Singh, Dr. Nirvikar for hosting this. Um, and yeah, I mean, ultimately, just the final word from my end is if I was hoping for folks to walk out with in this presentation with just two things, is one is, remember that the Gurdwara for us isn't just a place of worship. It is a social, political, educational, cultural, and religious hub. And then second is that history is not neutral. And if we aren't the caretakers, if we aren't the storytellers, somebody else will tell that story, and they will do it in the way that they want to, in the manner that they want to, without that respect that we would have. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Dr. Banipal. There was a illuminating talk and presentation. We don't realize how long we've been here in this country and how much we've done for the U.S. I I'm always fascinated by the Bhagat Singh Thind case, largely, and for people who don't know the larger context, he argued before the Supreme Court that he was a Caucasian because of his Indo-Aryan stock. And the Supreme Court agreed with him on the science of it. The argument the Supreme Court made was that you are not white enough in the eyes of the people. The term they used was in the common understanding of, that he was not white. So when we look at the parallel today, when we see today that he was being excluded because the common understanding seemed that he was not white. Today, in the words of Trump, people who are being excluded are those who are not compatible with Western civilization. So the argument is different, but there are some compelling parallels that can be drawn here. So and then when we look at the idea that Thins and the citizenship of other South Asians was stripped retroactively, we call that denaturalization today. And we in the last 20, 30 years or even more, there have been a handful of cases every year when people are denaturalized, and now USCIS has a quota of denaturalizing 100 people a month. So again, we see some parallels going back to that period. So when we look at the contemporary times, what can Sikhs teach our fellow Americans? Uh, how can we present the Bhagat Singh Thind case in a way that we caution people about this history, and also we caution policymakers about what they're trying to do here.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I think it's the Pakistan 10 case is very relevant to what we're seeing right now, right? Um, and I think it's a good lesson for us to revisit in the present day that despite serving his country, despite being a well-spoken individual, it doesn't matter. None of that mattered when it came to these institutions, and these institutions of power, because as I mentioned in my very first slide, when we're talking about power and these hierarchies that are in place, when somebody's allowing somebody to do something, this was embedded when Six first landed. You know, we were allowed to land. From there, we should have realized that it's an uphill battle and it's a battle that may never be resolved because we are constantly going to be at war. But with the Pakistan 10 case, we also see that the label and the mislabelings and the misunderstandings of who Sikhs were, despite the fact that he was making this anthropological argument and they didn't care about that. For them, he was an outsider. And I think that is something for us to really understand because it wasn't just the label Hindu or this me us being referred to as outsiders during the Pakistan 10 case, but when Saudi Arabia came to the global scene as these oil tycoons, Sikhs were in the United States were labeled as folks from Saudi Arabia, and we were the oil princess of Saudi Arabia. Then when we get the Iran crisis happening in the United States, Sikhs living here were targeted and referred to as Iranians, called Ayatollah, and then post 9/11 America, the mislabeling. So there's been a long history of Sikhs constantly being mislabeled by media, by Western media, and in response to that mislabeling, Sikhs have always sought out to educate individuals on, no, we're not Hindus or we're not Saudi Arabians, we're not Iranians, we're not Muslims, we're not Afghanis, we're not this. It's been something that's happened for the past 100 years. This it's continuing, but I think at the same time, um, that's okay. I think, when we look at Gurbani, it talks about, Bhagtan ki chaal nirali. We will be different. We are unique and we're distinct. We're meant to be like the devotees are meant to of the gurus are meant to be, distinct. And if we are targeted for being distinct, that's fine. We're meant to stand out. Again, the star for us is it's a crown that empowers us to stand with the communities, the lowest of the low, as Guru Nanak Sahib Ji did, right? Niche under niche jat, niche huat niche, standing with those individuals, not even with Pakistan Thind. What Pakistan Thind did at that time, he used that term and that definition of Caucasian to his advantage, rather than because there were still many individuals in the United States in 1923 who were ineligible for citizenship. Pakistan Thind had the opportunity to at least fight for citizenship at the Supreme Court level. But there were many individuals who never even had that opportunity. So I think the fact that he was stripped of this and now we are still being stripped of it, I think if we go back to what our history teaches us, what our Guru Sahib teaches us, right? And what Gurbani tells us is it's okay to be unique. It's okay to stand out. And again, Kutte Raj Bahaliya, right? Like what the government will always be the oppressor. So we have to look at that. We have to understand that the government will always be the oppressor. The government officials will always be the dogs that are licking the blood of the citizens. So I think understanding that that's okay, but in this time, in these dark times, let's not lose the light. Let's not start pointing the finger at other immigrant groups, but like we aren't the problem, target them. We aren't the problem. We are actually law-abiding citizens. Sikhs are loving people. Don't target us. Let's not pin the blame. If again, we should be standing with other immigrant communities and advocating because what is happening to us is happening to other communities as well. And that's what Sarbjit Pala teaches us, right? We're not only here to fight for ourselves, but also for all individuals across the US, but across the world as well. So I think, looking at Pakistan Tin's case and looking at it in the present day, I think it's very telling. I think there's definitely a lot of similarities. It's a lot of negativity, and we can get caught up on that negativity as well. But I think, looking at the fact that after Pakistan Tind was stripped of his citizenship, he went to the Gurdwara first. And at the Gurdwara, he found his Sangat. With his Sangat, he came up with what can we do next? Now when we have these conversations, when we have our brothers or sisters that are being deported or that are being picked up by ICE, are we having these town halls? Are we having these meetings at our local Gurdwara Sahibs where what can we do now? Or are we just staying at home being like, it's not our family that's being
Yeah,
impacted?
I don't think we are, right? I think we are just scared. We are not really, we don't see any gurdwaras holding special sessions or engaging with the public officials on this issue. We've got some of the organizations doing that separately, but as you mentioned, Stockton was the center of power. Uh, I think we've kind of lost that along the way.
Yeah, and that's what it was, right? Like, because in the US we have this whole separation of church and state, right? Like, there was an intentional idea for a lot of the later committee members. They didn't want a lot of this advocacy to happen in gurdwaras, and they didn't want politics to be in the gurdwara setting. But for us, the gurdwara is the space where we mobilize, and I think, like you said, there are a lot of amazing organizations that are doing the work, to whether it's the CDL issue that we are seeing, whether it is the immigration and ICE issues that we're seeing. There are a lot of organizations that are doing the work. Some gurdwaras I have seen that are having like this quick town hall, but that's like a quick one-off thing. But consistency, right? I think that is something that we can learn. On Bhagat Thind mobilized after his Supreme Court case. Are we mobilizing?
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation, and I want to switch gears a bit and talk about the Leap Sing Sound. And I'm wondering whether there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We've seen consistently people who lead us are often afraid of saying they are sick. So you've got the same phenomena happening with Sand, even though in some television interviews I've seen, he did embrace a Sikh identity publicly. But as the examples you gave, that pushing Dr. Marva aside and not wanting to be in the public eye, he was afraid. Uh, but now recently we've seen in New York, the mayor of New York, Mamdani, winning a race, but publicly avowing that he's a Muslim. Right? He's very vocal about it, and he's a proud Muslim. So are we turning the page, perhaps? Despite all the negativity we see, is America changing for the better?
Yeah, and I think, what we saw with the Lee Chang-son and what he did in order to get elected, and then we see and this isn't just an issue that, was is unique to the Punjabi Sikh community. There's a lot of issues when looking at, just BIPOC communities in general. A lot of them would also tell you that they have individuals who run for elected seats and they feel like these individuals were first community oriented, but once they get elected, then they kind of lose touch with the community. Or, they say, like, even when we talk about Barack Obama, there's been individuals who have said, from the Black community, who have said that, like, Barack Obama has lost touch, when he became president. So we see with a lot of different communities of colors, when we talk about that success in the West, there does tend to be some sort of, we are losing ourselves or losing touch with our community. But I think Mamdani is a prime example. We just recently saw this, and from when because I was following Mamdani when, he was walking the streets and no one wanted to talk to him. And he was just one individual walking around trying to get people trying to see, what do you care about? What do you want your government official to care about? And I think that level of just interacting with the community, that level of passion that you're showing, I think, not losing touch with who you are. Mamdani celebrated that, right? And we saw Babulicious singing in Punjabi at the inauguration, right? Like how like it's because he stayed true to his identity. And I think it is something for sure when we stay true to our identity, we will face issues, we will face hurdles. But I think, staying in Jardikla, right? That's a key concept of Sikhi. So I think staying in Jardikla, staying true to who we are, right? Living a truthful living is also about, is a huge aspect of Sikhi. And how could you live a truthful living if, you're trying to hide your identity? So I think with Mamdani, I think he's a prime example of we can still stay true to Sikhi, stay true to our identity. And if we are doing that grassroots work and really connecting with the citizens, it shouldn't impact like our identity shouldn't impact, the outcome.
Yeah, no, I agree, and we have some examples like Ravi Bhalla out of Hoboken, right? He's very proud of his identity. He doesn't hide it. Then you've got people like Nikki Haley and others who we haven't seen her family, the Sikh side of family, in public ever with her. So there are those contrasting images one can draw, but there are some positives, and I agree, being authentic really helps. And when people see you're authentic, they're going to support you in certain sense. I've got some questions from the audience that are coming in. So the first one is from K Singh. He was looking at your slides and asking in the first few slides, is Bakshish Singh here, Mr. Dillon, who was in the US around in 1885 or 1897, and his wife was Ratan Kaur, who arrived in 1910.
Yes, so it is the same Bakshi Singh. So Bakshi Singh was going back and forth quite a bit. Came to San Francisco, was in Astoria, was in the South Asian town, like the Alderbrook village up there as well. And it's the same individual. And like, Bakshi Singh's story and like his wife arriving in 1910 is something that it's a unique case because as I had mentioned, a lot of like Sikh women weren't allowed to come to the United States. So even the fact that Ratan Kaur had arrived in 1910, a lot of those individuals, the Sikh women who did come, either they were dressed up as men to ensure that no one could tell that they were a woman, or they were masking their identity in one way or another. But it is that same Bakshish thing. It was very common for Sikhs to be traveling up and down the Pacific coast. There's a lot of similarities. A good friend of mine in Vancouver, I've talked to him on numerous occasions, and this names that he knows and individuals that he knows from his research that have also been in Stockton and vice versa. So it was very common for them to travel up and down the Pacific coast in the earlier years.
That's great. So I've got another question from Professor Shindar Thandi from the UK. He's wondering, we've got pictures of Mexican women marrying Sikhs, and are there pictures of Caucasian women marrying Sikhs as well?
I do recall seeing several photos of Caucasian women and like the interracial marriages between Sikh men and Caucasian women. I do recall seeing several photos, and even the two individuals that I mentioned, Dalip Singh Sahm, Bhagat Singh Thind, both were married to white women as well. And then with even in like 1930, there was this huge news out of Denver. There was Gopal Singh Khalsa who married a white woman. And that again in this is in Denver, and it was like the news reached a number of different states because it was national news. So we do have some photos. I don't have them handy, but I do recall seeing a number of photos of Sikh marrying white women.
Simran Singh has a very interesting question. Sikhs are no strangers to state repression. We've seen state repression in Punjab for many decades. So, are there any lessons that Sikhs can teach about state repression uh, to our fellow Americans?
Yeah, I think they are, right? Like you had mentioned, like it's in the question, right? That Simmons had mentioned as well. Like we're used to seeing it in Punjab. And a lot of, like my parents' generation, they lived through it, they're familiar with it. Um, state repression, state torture, disappearances from the state, all of this stuff is familiar to the Sikh community. And I think for sure we can teach the broader general American public about this, about our experiences, what worked, what didn't work when we were fighting for justice. Again, being in the United States, there are certain things that will work in our favor versus, where it didn't in Punjab or in India. But I think more so it's about standing together with these communities that are facing this. Again, for example, what we're seeing with the Somalian community, right, or Mexican community in Latino community in California. It's important for us to do that because while we are supporting them in these dark times and those who are being picked up with ICE, the different community organizations, El Concilio, Faith in the Valley, whatever it may be at your local area, if we engage with them, while we are engaging with them to help support these different communities, alongside that, we can teach them, hey, this is what happened to us in the 80s and 90s. This is how we responded. This is how then the government responded to what we did. So I think there is, but I think it's a matter of us actually putting ourselves out there and engaging with the communities that are out there and with the orgs that are out there rather than being, armchair anthropologist type, armchair scholars sitting in our ivory towers and or sitting at home looking at social media and not really being aware of what's going on the ground. Um, that's what I would say. So we can definitely teach others about state repression and how to respond to it. But I think it's more important for us to actually lead by example and put ourselves out there as well, right? That's what the Guru Sahibs did. That's what the Singhs and Kaurs of the 80s and 90s did. And I think now is the time for us to do the same, right? A lot of organizations ask for legal observers and there's a chance and opportunity for us to go through legal observer trainings, when people are dealing with ICE or there's protest happenings. These individuals are the ones that are making sure everything is going according to the law. So there's different ways for us to get involved. And I think as we do that, it's, now we can teach individuals about the state repression that we faced.
We've got the last question from Sonia Dhami. She's wondering about the absence of women from the narrative. Do we bear some of that responsibility as educators? And can you perhaps talk about it more generally, what you've seen?
Yes, it's a huge problem, right? When we talk about Sikhi versus Punjabi culture, the topic of gender comes up, and it's something that has been an issue, and has always been an issue. When looking at the archives, again, when we look at it historically, a lot of Sikh women weren't allowed in the United States, so that's why the absence is there. But then also just thinking about the patriarchal society that we live in, a lot of the times women are expected to stay in the households and not travel outside. So with that, again, that's why they might also be absent. But then one of the biggest things that I've been doing lately is conducting oral history interviews. Just reaching out to our elders, reaching out to the Bajogs and interviewing them and gathering their personal histories because a collection of personal histories tells our broader story. A few years back, I was interviewing this Bibi who has been here since the 60s, and several people had told me that she has a lot of knowledge and a lot to share. When I went to go talk to BBG, the first time I went to talk to her, we spent almost 30, 45 minutes just having a general conversation. No recording, no interview actually happening. It was just a general conversation. And in that conversation, not once, but multiple times she told me, and she was adamant on like, Deshwal, why are you talking to me? I have nothing to offer. I have nothing to tell you. Go talk to some other like uncle, right? We have, because of the patriarchal society that we live in, despite like we have Bibian and we have Gars in our community who have done so much. But hearing this Bibi, it reminded me that like, she didn't want to share anything because she was told that her voice did not matter. Her voice wasn't important enough. No one's ever asked her, BBG, tell me your story. So for her, it was something new and it was something that she was really hesitant. She didn't know what I was going to do with it. She didn't know what the purpose was. So I think it is on us as well. there are Sikh women that have made history, that are continuing to make history, but they are absent from the archives. They are absent from public narratives. In the earlier history, they are absent because there were legislation in place that restricted them from coming. So we see a lot of them absent. But again, even in the Stockton Gurdwara archives, on the pages that we have that show who donated money to Stockton Gurdwara and its establishment in like the early 19 teens, this page is full of Sikh men, but there are like two Sikh women that are there that donated to Stockton Gurdwara. So they are there. It's just a matter of us looking. And then if they are not there, that doesn't mean that they didn't contribute to society, they didn't contribute to history. I think now in the present day, I think it's more important, even in terms of like oral histories, because our community has a habit of making history without writing it down and without you know acknowledging it. We are constantly making history, but if we don't document it, somewhere down the road, the narrative will change, what happened will change, characters will be forgotten. And I think that comes to, this story, right? Like sometimes in newspapers, whose name is shared is those who are the loudest, right? Sometimes the Bibian who are making and the Gors who are doing a lot of the work are the quiet voices that are really pushing a lot of things forward. And I think it's us as a community to also be mindful of that and in ensure that when we are doing anything, even at the local level, if we're talking about the present day, at the local level, if you are going to do something, make sure it's not just a bunch of uncles and a bunch of men in that space. Invite the Sikh women as well. Invite them to share their perspectives and their voices. Invite, the elder Sikh women to also be in the space when they are talking about Sikh American history. So I think we do have to do a much better job. You know, it is, as I had mentioned earlier, who um, who controls, what history is told is whoever cares about it. And if those that care about it don't care about Sikh women history won't be included. So it's on us to also care about Sikh women history and their role and what they have done in terms of Sikh American history too.
Right. No, thank you. That's a very important point about documenting and making sure we include women in these conversations. So with that, I would like to thank Dr. Benipal for such a wonderful, illuminating conversation. Want to thank the Sikh Foundation and the UC Santa Cruz Endowed Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies, and also all of our participants and the audience for taking out your valuable time to join us. Without your support, this wasn't really possible. So thank you. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ